Hey there, before we jump into this interview with Jenny Blake, which is fantastic, by the way, I just wanted to let you know that I'm hosting a free 30-minute webinar on employee performance management today, June 7th at 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where I'll be showing you the 3 reasons why employees underperform and then how to correct behavior to increase your team's productivity. So to sign up, just go over to yourbestmanager.com/webinar, enter your name and email address, and I will see you then. Here is Your Best Manager, episode 86.
He would make a point to start every one-on-one with feedback. Do you have any feedback for me? And he would give me feedback, and it helped to reduce the nerves I had around it because he would often give positive feedback. It wasn't something...
Hey everybody, and welcome to the Your Best Manager podcast, featuring interviews with senior managers and leadership experts, as well as practical advice for first-time managers. And after today's show, be sure to hop over to yourbestmanager.com and check out the What If Project. Starting June 1st, it's 30 days, 30 leadership tips, 30 baby steps, and 30 opportunities to become a different kind of manager. Have fun. If change is the only constant, let's get better at it. This is Jamie Newman here, and I'm excited to be joined by Jenny Blake today. Jenny, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me, Jamie.
It's a privilege to have you on the show, Jenny. Jenny Blake is an author, career and business strategist, and international speaker who helps people organize their brain, move beyond burnout, and build sustainable, dynamic careers they love. She's the author of Pivot, The Only Move That Matters Is Your Next One, which recently won an award for Axiom Best Business Book in the Careers category, and Life After College. After 2 years in a technology startup, followed by 5 years at Google in training and career development, Jenny moved to New York City in 2011, where she's been running her own consulting business in the years since. Jenny combines her love of technology with her superpower of simplifying complexity to help clients pivot their career or business. And her motto is, if change is the only constant, let's get better at it. And as I said, I'm really excited to jump into this conversation with Jenny. I heard her chatting about her recent book, Pivot, on a couple of other podcasts, and I just know that this is going to be a really important conversation for many of you listening today. But Jenny, before we jump into the nitty-gritty, why don't you take a moment and give us some more context into your career path and just share how you got to where you are today?
Sure. So I started my career early. I was a junior at UCLA, and one of my professors was starting a political polling startup with a Stanford professor.
Oh, yeah.
So I ended up taking a leave of absence, moving home to go work at the startup as the first employee. And I was there as it grew to 30 over 2 years. I went back to finish school, graduate with my class. And then when I hit a plateau there, the career conversation that I regret the most is the one I never had, which was to tell the founder that I was getting bored. And so I, in a way, looking back, that set the tone for me getting really passionate about how do we have people better have career conversations and become a translator between managers and employees. And then because I was managing the AdWords accounts at the startup, I actually ended up getting a job doing AdWords product training for new hires at Google. Mm-hmm. And once again, about a year in, I'd been doing in-class training all day, every day, trained 1,000 people in my first year. Mm-hmm. Pretty soon after, realized I didn't want to talk about AdWords forever, but I loved working with people. Mm-hmm. So I went and did coach training on nights and weekends and became a manager at Google by the time I was 24. So that was a big leap in my career in terms of challenging myself. And within 6 months, I was asked to tell half my team's 3 people that they no longer had a role. So it wasn't really my decision, but they had 30 days, or maybe it was 60, to find another role within Google or leave the company. And that really devastated me. So that was the side of being a manager that I just, no matter how many books you read, is just so hard to prepare for something like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then was at Google 2.5 more years, though I was kind of happy to relinquish the role as manager and move into career development programming and coaching. And then I left 6 years ago when my first book came out and have been running my own business in New York ever since.
Yeah, and I've got to ask, I'm sure this question comes up way too often, so I'll try and ask it maybe a little bit differently, but how tough of a decision is it to quit a company like Google? Because, I mean, that's the place everyone's like, oh, it's the best place in the world to work. They've got the coolest people, they've got the coolest offices and all that. And so how was that a difficult decision, or I mean, we're talking
Very
about
much
career
so.
conversations, so
Yeah, very, very difficult. And I mean, now you hear stories like that all the time, but at that time, it wasn't as common that people were doing this. And I would even have mentors of mine, coaches, people I looked up to that would say to me, "Hey, can you put my resume in?" And that was really discouraging to me because here are people I looked up to outside of the company who actually wished they could work there. And then I felt like maybe I'm just one of those entitled millennials that the media keeps talking about because I'm at a dream company in a dream role. I was doing global career development programs and managing authors at Google, meeting my author heroes. What more could I have possibly asked for?
yeah.
And yet I felt like I was not fully operating in my zone of genius. Like there was about 30% of my work that I just totally lit me up and I was on fire. And then a growing percentage that felt kind of bureaucratic or just the machinations of a big company, even though Google is an incredible one. And so by the time my first book was coming out, it was so hard to leave. I had no clue. I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I never thought like, oh yeah, I'm out of here any day now. I really was just burning out from trying to manage both Google and my side hustle, the Life After College blog and then book. And so I felt like, well, I can't do both. That much is clear. And I know I'll forever regret not at least trying to go my own way. And if I try and I fail and I have to go back to Google, fine. But at least I want to know that I tried. And I joke in Pivot that I call certainly anyone listening to a podcast like yours, Jamie, but high net growth individuals. So we don't just optimize for money. We wonder, am I learning and growing and ultimately making an impact? And I say that we don't have FOMO, we have FONT, fear of not trying.
Yeah.
So ultimately that's what drove the decision.
Yeah, and I can relate to that because I didn't work at Google, but I worked at an absolutely incredible organization, and I was there for over 8 years, and it was the first job I had out of college, and I remember I wanted to get hired there because everyone I interacted with cared about people, and so the leadership there was just incredible. But there came that same point for me where, I wouldn't say bored, but I wasn't operating. I mean, you said it perfectly. I wasn't operating in my zone of genius, and it can be tough when you work for a great company. It can be very tough to leave. I'm sure if you work for an awful company, it may be quite easy. But I remember the conversation, and I'm going to transition this into another question for you in a second. But I remember, before I went to talk to my boss, I remember like shaking. Like I was so like, how do I have
Me
this
too.
conversation?
Yeah.
Like I was on the road. I was in sales, and I like parked my car, and I had to like go like pump myself up. I was like, how am I going to do this? I've got to call and schedule a time to sit down with my boss and have a conversation that I'm not sure I want to be here. And so it can be obviously nerve-wracking. So my question, though, for you is, because you already kind of referenced this before, but why are career conversations so difficult to have? Or maybe a better question would be, why are people afraid to have them? Because you said like you didn't have the career conversation you should have initially at that startup. So like, why is that?
Well, it's so important to recognize that there's fear on both sides, both employees and managers. Employees fear that if they say, and the reason I wrote Pivot is to give us all language that is more judgment neutral than I'm having a career crisis or I'm bored. These things are they're non-neutral.
Right.
Whereas I'm at a pivot point. I'm hitting a plateau. A pivot point just says, okay, I'm ready to grow. Even grow within a person's role can be a pivot point. Becoming a manager for the first time is a huge pivot point in someone's career. So it opens the door to talk about change in a way that isn't as loaded. And so employees fear that if they talk about what's wrong or what they're wanting more of, that they're going to come across as having one foot out the door or being entitled or complaining. Yeah. And then managers are afraid, well, if I open this up, what if my employee doesn't want to stay here? What if they're not happy? Or what if I don't know how to have... A lot of managers think they know how to have career conversations. They're more telling advice than doing actual coaching of kind of facilitating the other person's best thinking. And managers also on both sides feel I'm busy. We have more important things to worry about. Or for managers, maybe it's not rewarded to set time aside to have career conversations. Or they worry if they manage someone up and off their team, that's a problem, when really it's a sign that they're a great manager. So both sides are fearful, just like you. When I gave 2 weeks notice, my hands were shaking and I was so nervous. And I notice even now, I don't have anyone on my team full time, but when I'm doing check-ins with my communications director, I'm nervous when we get to the career conversation, just because, well, how's it going to go? What's she going to say? What feedback does she have for me? Yeah. So none of us are immune, and it's charged because we all want the best for each other. We want the best for the organization, hopefully. And sometimes there aren't easy answers, but the more important thing is broach the subject and both parties be really open to, hey, we don't have to solve anything in this conversation, but let's just be clear. And for employees to know that someone is listening to them, even if they can't answer every single item on their wish list, that just having the conversation alone can make a huge impact.
Yeah, so true. And especially that part about, I don't know, I think as an employee sometimes, regardless of whether you're a manager and you're thinking about your director or the executive you have to talk to, for some reason it comes across like, well, why would they be afraid to talk about it? But I still remember I wanted to get promoted. And so I sent my boss at the time, he was in a different office, I sent him a calendar invite that just said my career. Hey, I'd like to chat about my career. And he called me within like 3 seconds. He's like, what's wrong? I was like, he's like, obviously it's important. You put time in my calendar. You said my career. And I'm like, oh, I actually wanted to talk about what I can do to get promoted. He's like, oh, you have no idea how many times people put like I want to talk about my career and it's because they're going to quit.
Oh man.
And it's just because typically that's because people avoid the conversation so much. And I mean, this leads to why it's so important to have them. If you don't have career conversations, you're eventually going to have a career conversation. And if you don't create that space, if you're a manager for your employees to feel comfortable coming to you with their challenges, or if you're an employee and you don't take that risk and ask for feedback, ask for advice, ask for direction, you're eventually going to have a career conversation where your performance is either dropped and you're getting terminated, or you're quitting, or your employees are going to quit. There are consequences to not having the career discussion. So it's like it's I guess it'd be the same. And Jenny, I'll ask for your thoughts on this as well. But I'd imagine it's the same with the performance conversation. There's a lot of managers who are afraid to address bad performance issues, but ignoring them doesn't make things better. It typically makes things worse. And it's the same with the career discussion, right?
It's so true. Yes, and I'm glad you brought up performance reviews, because although the emotions can be similar, one mistake that a lot of managers make is conflating the two. They think that, well, if we're doing performance reviews or evaluations, now's a great time to talk about career. And in fact, the employee is quite nervous. Yeah. They're nervous. They don't know what to expect. It's really not the time that they're most open to share their hopes and dreams.
Yeah.
They just want to do well. They want to see how their performance is going to affect bonuses or compensation or promotion. It's really not the time. And so the better thing to do is try and alternate. If you do performance evaluations twice a year, do career conversations in the other 2 quarters. Or if you do them once a year, do career conversations every 6 months. And that way, you also send the message as a manager that the career conversation is not just about promotion. Because one misnomer that a lot of employees have is that, well, let's talk about my career. How do I get promoted? Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a short-sighted way to look at career, because there won't always be a promotion available. And often, especially at Google, people were getting very antsy for promotion really early on, but there can only be one CEO. Yeah. So at a certain point, promotions are going to slow, and they're not everything. And to that end, I would encourage employees to ask, what is it about a promotion that is exciting to me? Or what would that bring me? For some people, they care about the money. For others, recognition. For others, the responsibilities on their plate. So for employees and managers, if you can ask, well, beyond the promotion itself, what's important to you about that? Then it opens up creative ways to get there without just waiting for the promotion itself.
So, yeah, so good. And I love that tip you gave to just have formal career conversations that are something exciting for the employees to look forward to, because it doesn't even matter if you're a top performer, and I've been a top performer and I've been a struggling performer. Both times I get nervous going into a performance review, because you're walking into a judgment on some level. But when it's career, like, that can be exciting. So I think that's a great tip. And then the other tip I just add on to that that I talk about quite often on this show is the just value of having weekly one-on-one conversations with your people. Because when you have that career discussion and you know it's important to one of your employees, well, every week you can talk about that in just tiny little increments over a one-on-one meeting, so that it's not only twice a year you're talking about careers, and it's not only twice a year you're talking about performance, but you're talking about those things on a regular basis, which continues to create comfort around both of those subjects. So, man, we are off to a great start, but we're going to keep going. So, congratulations on building such a successful career, Jenny, and congratulations on taking the leap and writing Pivot, as well as the success of your blog, Life After College, and the book. Here's the big question for the interview. When you look back on your career, who was your best manager? And maybe it wasn't a manager, so it could be a mentor, but who's had the most significant influence on your career and why?
My best manager is Steve Maxwell. He's still at Google, and he really made such a lasting impact on me, partly because he was so great at giving and receiving feedback. And feedback, as you said, it's always something that intimidated me, but he was so good at really making it a routine part of our one-on-ones. He would make a point to start every one-on-one with feedback. Do you have any feedback for me? And he would give me feedback, and it helped to reduce the nerves I had around it, because he would often give positive feedback. It wasn't, sometimes we associate feedback with this, oh God, what are they going to tell me? What am I doing wrong? And it's not. It can be a neutral thing that we managers can get in the habit of giving feedback. And he was great at giving specific feedback as well. So not just saying, you did a great job in the presentation, but specifically what I saw you do was frame it up really well, articulate the concepts very clearly. Your presentation skills and this and that way were fantastic. So on that level, he was amazing. And his feedback still resonates to this day. He also wore more of a coach hat. So he wouldn't just tell me what to do. He would really empower me to think through problems first and solve them first. And he was a great brainstormer. So Steve is just famous for his whiteboarding. Like, he's so good at drawing models and concepts, and has such great vision. It's such a beautiful blend of left brain logic and right brain kind of coaching, heart-centered care for his team. So he really just pushed us. He's the manager that I had when I became a manager, and I learned so much from him.
There's so much in there. And so I'm going to just share a couple highlights from that little bit. But if you're listening, just go back and, I don't know, a minute, 2 minutes, and listen to that again, because there's some super good actionable advice. I like how he didn't just give you feedback, but he asked for feedback. I think that's really important. And I think that that's sometimes something that managers miss, is they think constantly about, it's my job to correct, or it's my job to make someone better, but miss the opportunity and the value that comes from soliciting feedback and just asking, hey, how am I doing? What can I be doing better? So I think that was the first point I took away. The second was, you mentioned oftentimes it was positive. And beyond that, you mentioned it was specific. So it wasn't just, hey, you did a good job this week, but it was, hey, you did a good job on this presentation where you did X. And the thing that I want everyone listening to take away is, you have to actually think about that and plan that ahead of time. If you're going to walk into a feedback conversation, plan how you are going to deliver it. Like, write down some great things. When you see them happening in real time, write things down so that when you have a conversation later, you can easily recall them and give specific feedback. Because just a high five, and I got some really tough feedback once because one of my employees told me they didn't feel valued, and it bothered me, because I'm like, what are you talking about? I tell you, you're doing a great job all the time. I high five you, which is a stupid thing to say. And she's like, I don't care about your high fives, and you'd never tell me what I'm doing well. You just say I'm doing a good job. I'm like, boom, you're right.
Wow.
And yeah, so. Yeah.
I like what you said about tracking it. Steve was very good about that. He made a point to attend trainings I would go to, meetings I would lead. He was taking notes all the time. He just made it such a habit. And by the way, my friend Michael Bungay Stanier wrote a book called The Coaching Habit,
Yeah.
which is outstanding for managers to read. It's how to coach in 7 minutes or less. And he also has a program through his company Box of Crayons called The Feedback Habit. So these are two great resources if someone's listening thinking.
Yeah, I've got to get him on the show. His book's been recommended a couple times, and I haven't even reached out yet, and that's bad on me because I think he'd be a great guest to have on the show as well. But yeah, and I'll make sure those books and that book and program is linked up in the show notes. But sorry, continue. I cut you off.
No, I was also going to say, this is looping back to career conversations real quick.
Yeah.
I encourage people to try different formats. So I really enjoyed doing those as walk-in talks or coffee or over lunch. And as managers, one mistake they have to make is taking notes. And what it does is remove them from being fully present and making eye contact. So I encourage, feedback, one-on-ones. They could even start, it depends how much time you have, but don't be afraid to change the setting to make some of this feel more relaxed as well. Like it can just help to be moving and outdoors. You don't have to be sometimes just by nature of sitting in office chairs in a room with computers open creates a different mood or feeling for these things that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, it must be psychology, and I don't understand the science behind it, but I know from experience that it's true because there are just some settings where it's intimidating, and one of those intimidating settings is the boss's office. And so you got to recognize that. Sure, there are things you can do to make your office welcoming and comfortable, but if you're called into the boss's office, it's the same, and I don't know whether it goes back to the principal's office at school, but there's a natural discomfort there, and I think that's a great tip. The second thing that I took away from what you were talking about earlier was just in regards to coaching. And so, first of all, a point I took away was being solutions-driven versus directive. Sometimes, and I personally think it's maybe a self-confidence issue why managers do this, but sometimes managers, and I was guilty of this myself, I wanted to look like I knew what I was doing, so I'd be very directive. Oh, you need to do this, and then this, and then this. But it's going to be more effective if you can lead through being inquisitive and asking questions and brainstorming and saying, hey, well, what would you do? What do you think? You don't always have to look like you have all the answers, and sometimes you won't, and brainstorming can come up with the answers where you still come across as the leader because you created the environment for the solution to happen, not because you had the answer ahead of time. So that was one other thing I took away. But here's my question. You mentioned that he cared. And I've asked this question on the show a couple of times to different people, but how do you show someone that you care? Because you can't really fake it.
So true. Yep. Good point. I think listening goes a long way. So just by manager, for example, manager can email their entire team and say, hey, I would love to have career walk and talks with each of you. Schedule an hour on my calendar sometime in the next 2 months. That is such an easy thing for the manager to do. They don't have to do any more heavy lifting than that. And then each person on the team sets the time aside. So it's showing that, hey, I want to make time for you, even if they're not the one necessarily handling all the logistics. Part of showing that they care is understanding the whole person. So not being afraid to ask, well, what would you want to do beyond Google or beyond whatever organization? I had one person on my team where when I asked her that question, she said, ultimately, I just want to be a school teacher someday. And cool. I was glad she told me that. And so we looked for projects where she could do more in-class training while at Google rather than behind the computer creating strategy decks, for example.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then I think showing that you care. Well, I just want to speak to what you said about giving advice. It's a balance. So as managers, they're usually really good at problem solving. And so try two different hats. The coaching hat is much more open-ended. You're asking the person, I'm happy to weigh in with my opinion, but first, what do you think? What let's frame this up. Do you want to brainstorm a little bit? But if you're going to just lead them to some predetermined answer that you already know, that you're stuck on, that you know is the way, just say it. So that's where sometimes managers fall into the trap of, well, let me try and coach them to this solution, which feels very weird as the coachee. It feels like, where are you taking me?
I've
what do you
done
want
that
me
way
to
too many
say?
times. And there's like,
Yeah.
can you just tell me what you're looking for? I don't know what answer you're trying to figure out.
Exactly. So that's where leading questions will create that feeling. So only brainstorm and do coaching when you are genuinely open to any outcome, or
Such a good point.
or be more explicit with what you do, what are the known variables and what are unknowns you can brainstorm together.
Yeah, love that. And just to highlight something that you said about the caring thing, what you were talking about, and what you were saying that your best manager had done for you was they were intentional. And I mean, the visual that I had that demonstrated care was, I mean, you didn't talk about him hugging you. I don't know if that's appropriate depending on on your environment, but you didn't talk about showing affection through care. You talked about something that for me really resonated, and that was going to the meetings you ran and taking notes. Because even if that's awkward or uncomfortable or intimidating to have your boss in there, the fact that he did that demonstrated he cared about making you great. And everybody at their job, no one wakes up saying, I want to do worse today than I did yesterday. People want to do better. And when a manager just takes an invested interest in helping them be better, even though sometimes those feedback conversations are going to be uncomfortable, that shows that you care. Because if you don't care, you're not going to help your people, and you're not going to try and make them better, and you're not going to have good conversations or tough conversations with them. So, yeah, I love that you brought all that up. And if we keep going down this, we're going to run way out of time. I've got one more unplanned question that
Sure.
I'd like some of your opinion on, and hopefully I can formulate this without tripping over my words. But one of the big things that I find I always talk about on the show is employee engagement. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the consequences of not pivoting as a manager to employee engagement. And the reason I say that is oftentimes I find, at least most of the discussions on employee engagement are, hey, managers, how do you engage your employees? And I always like to look a level up and be like, well, is the manager actually engaged? And if you do not pivot, if you do not handle these career challenges, questions, opportunities properly, can you just talk a little bit about the consequences to your leadership capabilities?
Sure. It's really that you become calcified as an organization. So if you're not having these conversations and allowing people to move internally or to stretch within their role, to take on side projects, 10% projects, even going to training courses outside of work, then people become stuck, and no high net growth individual, as I shared that term at the beginning, is going to stay put for very long in a scenario where they don't see themselves growing. There was a handful of people I interviewed for the book and who I've worked with over many years doing career coaching, where to leave their company is not their first or desired option. People don't just hit a plateau, get bored, and say, I'm out of here. They want to stay. But if they hit wall after wall or feel too much bureaucracy, too much red tape, that nobody's listening, that they're not able to move, then they will leave. So the important thing about creating a pivot-friendly culture is giving people room to breathe, room to create, room to lead. And this does not mean that everyone needs to pivot outside of the company. I always commend companies who hire me to speak, because they must on some level be worried that I'm going to tell everybody to pivot their way right out of there. But it's more about pivot as a framework for mapping what's next, even within your existing role. And so companies can create pivot-friendly culture by asking people to reflect on, well, what's next for me within the coming year, even within my role? And a pivot can be taking on a side, part of pivot is pilots, running small experiments. So for both employees and organizations, don't wait until there's a full-time role open in order to grow. When I was first at Google, I started an office book club. And I would pick a business book for us all to read once a month. And it was often relating to training and leadership development, which was the team that we were on. And that was so fun. I had no intention of having a full-time role as Google's book club leader, but it really enriched my role. And then later I ended up managing Google's Authors at Google program for a little while. And so it did actually come back around, and I've loved books my whole life. But I encourage people to look for projects that you can tackle to grow without waiting for a full-time role. And similarly for managers, look for ways, assignments you can give your team that are in line with their 1-year vision without putting the pressure on yourself to have to solve their entire career vision overnight.
Yeah, love it. Some great advice there. Jenny, do you know who Lee Caraher is?
I don't.
So Lee Caraher, I had her on the show a couple weeks ago. She was episode 72, if anyone wants to check that out. But she wrote a book called The Boomerang Principle, and you and her would get along extremely well because she talks about this concept of creating lifelong loyalty and not being afraid to have people quit. Because and she talked about this, but the benefits of having that conversation of, hey, what do you want to do? What's important to you? And then trying to find ways to align their job to maximize your people's strengths. In order to have that conversation, you have to be unafraid to let people go because sometimes the pivots are going to be external. As a manager, if you don't have the information, you can't help the pivots be internal, but there are going to be some times where those conversations are going to lead to people leaving. And if you make a fantastic experience for a top employee to exit your company, that's not a bad thing if you are helping that person become better and you're going to create lifelong loyalty to your company, which has so many good benefits. So you just made me think about that.
100%. I don't know why more companies don't do alumni networks because I'm still working with Google to this day. They still bring me in to speak. I'm consulting with them, different groups around the company when they have offsites. I love working with Google. I love Google. I love my former colleagues there, the culture. I love everything about it. It's not a fit for me to work there full time, but I'm so grateful to still be partnering with them. And so I thank you for bringing that book up. I just think it's such an important principle and something so many could benefit from. And even I spoke at Microsoft and they had quite a few returning employees, people who had left and then came back.
Yeah. So good. Well, we are going to run out of time because I talk too much. But I do have one.
These are great questions.
But one last thing before you go. What's exciting happening in your world? And if I'm listening and I want to connect with you and learn more, obviously I'm going to want to pick up the book if I'm listening. But what's going on in your world right now?
Yeah, well, I'm really excited about all the programs. I love working with companies and helping bridge these gaps that we talked about on this episode. So one of the things I'm most excited about, I created a 1-hour pivot workshop that managers can run with their teams. So you don't even need me there. You don't even have to have read the book, but you get a full facilitation guide and can walk your team through a 1-hour Map What's Next workshop. So if you want more info on that, that's at pivotmethod.com/workshops. And I would love to hear how it goes if anyone wants to try it, because I just want to spread the word on Pivot and giving people some options and more clarity, because change can be so stressful for all of us, and our organizations are changing more now than ever before. I joke in the book that at Google we were reorging more than we were orging. So that's a lot for everybody to adjust to, managers and employees alike.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're doing is great. I will make sure that your website and everything, as well as your book recommendation and your books, are linked up in the show notes, which are really easy to find over at yourbestmanager.com. There's just a little magnifying glass in the top right-hand corner, and you can search Jenny or Pivot, and the show notes from today's show will come up. And just one more thing that I just wanted to say before we close. We're not going to have time to talk about it, but there was something very subtle that you said that I just want to make sure everybody pays attention to. You had mentioned that when you wanted to grow your career, you took classes at night to become a manager. And you also mentioned that when you wanted to consider starting a business, you started hustling on the side. And I think the little mini lesson there is, if something's important to you, you need to invest time in training and development outside of what your company is giving you. You need to find opportunities, take advantage, and if things are important, you're going to do that. So just a little shout out there for self-development. But other than that, it's time to say goodbye. And managers, I'm not sure if you are traveling to or from work right now, getting a workout in, or simply taking some time to relax and listen today. But I hope that you've been encouraged and inspired from our conversation with Jenny Blake. Jenny, thanks again for sharing some of your story with the next generation of leaders. I truly appreciate it, and we will talk soon.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I loved all your questions. This is such an important topic, and huge thanks to everybody who's here listening.
All right, everyone, that does it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Now hop over to yourbestmanager.com and take advantage of the free tools, resources, and training which I've created exclusively for you, the next generation of leaders. Oh, and have fun.